I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're exploring an amazing book. It is called Roni's Story, A Daughter of Africa by Veronica Walker. It is a gripping memoir of resilience, identity, and strength. As a second-generation white African, Walker recounts her powerful journey in a patriarchal society, overcoming deep loss and reclaiming her voice. It's a courageous tale of motherhood, womanhood, and the fight to be seen as more than someone's possession. We're delighted to be joined by the author's son today, Phillipe Walker, and we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below this interview. And be sure to download the Spotlight Network TV app streaming on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV. And we'd like to thank the team at Books to Life Marketing for helping us put Phillipe in the spotlight today. Phillipe, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is such a beautiful memoir that your mother wrote. About when did she start writing her life story?
Very bizarrely, she started writing her life story about 15 years before she actually died. It came about because she got bored when she had retired, and she also wanted to put her story down because it is a fairly unique story, and she wanted her grandchildren to understand her life, which, having lived in England all their lives, they would not have understood. And it came about because my niece was at college. My sister then joined her to do a course at the same college. And then my mother joined at the same college at the same time. So all three generations were at the same college at the same time, doing various things. So my mother started doing it at the same time.
Amazing, amazing. That's a great genesis of this beautiful story. What made you decide you're the one who actually published it, right? It was kind of a personal memoir up until the time you decided to put your mom's story out there?
I published it after she died because I needed something. The manuscript would not have lived in itself, so I had it published. And then several people read it and thought, well, it's actually it's an amazing story of a woman's life through Africa. There are so many different themes that you can pick out in this book. And I think also it also shows, that life in the colonies wasn't always a bed of roses for white people. They weren't always rich and powerful. My family particularly were certainly not rich or powerful. My grandfather was indeed a failed prospector and a failed farmer. If it wasn't for my grandmother, my mother and her two sisters would have starved. So there's a lot of stories all the way down that needed to be recognized. Because once my mother's generation goes, there is nobody left to remember that.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a unique time. It is a unique history. Talk to us a little bit about what it means or what it meant for your mother to be a second generation white African.
My mother was very proud to be a Rhodesian. Africa is a very funny place, it does get into your skin. It gets under your skin and into your blood. And you remain an African. I have lived in Europe now for over about 40 years. I still regard Africa as my home. And it's the same sort of thing. Africa gets into your body, it gets into your blood, into your psyche. It's actually very difficult to get rid of that. So she was very proud of that. Um, and she was very proud of the history and what we had done um, in Zimbabwe as it is now, in Rhodesia, how we actually built it up, how white people had built it up. Also, I think our relationship in that country was less toxic with the Black people than other places were at that time, and to today probably.
Were there dangers being a white person in Rhodesia at the time?
It's not. I think there's always a danger in Africa because you are so far away from anything. Um, one of the things is that if you leave a town, I grew up in the Rhodesian War, which was after the book finished, my mom's book finished. But as an example, if I left a town, a large town before 3 o'clock, I could then guarantee I could get to the next town before sundown. If I left after 3, then I would always certainly get to that town in the darkness. Bearing in mind that there were no roads, or the roads were always gravel roads. If you had a puncture or an accident, you could be waiting 2 or 3 days before the next person came down that road. Mm. So in that respect, yes, there was danger. Not so much from the people. People always forget, that Black people's, and I mean Black people, and I mean all the tribes in Zambia and Zimbabwe, their culture is based on hospitality. Hmm. So if people did have a breakdown and you were near a kraal, there was always a Black person who would help you because that was their culture to help you. Mm. Because, yeah. So it wasn't always a danger particularly.
Exactly. It's just the remoteness of the area that if you're all alone on a gravel road after dark in anywhere in the world, it could be a dangerous situation because it presents an opportunity, obviously, for people who are predators and they can be anywhere in the world. Tell us about your mother's upbringing in Rhodesia, what that was like, and how it shaped her views on womanhood and on independence.
My mother was born in a very small town on the border between Rhodesia and Mozambique. It was called Umtali. It is now called Mutari. Um, my grandmother was working for the Rhodesian State Lottery at the time, and she actually ran a orphanage. So she had a lot of kids whose parents had been killed in various ways in her house. So when my mother was born, that's where they lived. My grandfather I think he was farming in Mozambique at the time, because my mother remembers going on holiday to Beira, which is the town kind of directly across in Mozambique, and having all her clothes eaten by a goat that came onto the beach. So she kind of remembers that as her first memory of the sea. My mother grew up, and that's where they were. They were very isolated because, you'd go to one person once a week, and that person would then have the telephone, and that person would then phone somebody else in another town, and that's how they got their news. So it was just once a week, and you had to listen in on the telephone line to see what was happening in the world. There were quite a lot of old people at the time who had never even seen a telephone or a car, because they had come to that area on Volkswagens. and they continued living in Oxford, and so cars and things like that were not part of them. My grandfather then became bankrupt, so they moved to Salisbury. And at the same time, my mother was about 7 or 8 at the time, and she went to the convent because my grandmother was a very stout Catholic. They went to the convent, and the convent was run by German nuns, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Then my grandfather died, leaving my grandmother with a 17-year-old daughter, a 15-year-old daughter, and a 10-year-old daughter to look after. So my grandmother started a guest house. So she took in a lot of old miners and looked after them because they didn't have anywhere else to go. They had no family. And my mother was then kind of left to my 2 aunts to bring up because my mother was so busy running the guest house. The war came, the Second World War came, and a lot of Rhodesian men, I think it was about 80% of the white Rhodesian population, left Rhodesia to join the Commonwealth Army to go into the Second World War. And this is kind of where I kind of have so much respect for the nuns in Salisbury at the time, because they were German nuns and they were stuck in a town in what was an English colony. So all the children that they were teaching were going off to fight possibly their relatives. And I think it's quite an amazing thing to think that these nuns actually just stayed there and were very supportive of all their students. But nobody really gave a thought that these nuns may have been related to somebody in the Nazis or been killed in Germany or whatever. Other than that, my mother's growing up was actually quite a lovely way to grow up. She had a bicycle. They all had bicycles because cars were not often around at the time. So everywhere you went, you had to go on a bike, sometimes 20, 30 miles on a bike ride was nothing. You know, for me, a 5-mile bike ride and I'm nearly dead. So, you know, she did very well. My grandmother also took in airmen during the Second World War, because we had a lot of airmen came to Rhodesia at the time. And one of those airmen was my father. He was a Scotsman who came to South Africa to teach young men how to fly planes. And then instead of going back home to Scotland when he finished, he stayed and began farming. My mother was getting to the age of 24, and my grandmother was having hysterics because, my God, my daughter's 24. She has to get married, otherwise she's going to be on the shelf, and we're never going to get her married. And oh my God, what are we going to do? So culturally, she sort of had to look around for a husband. And I know this sounds a bit clinical, but it wasn't quite as clinical as it sounds. But she ended up with my father. My father was 13 years her senior. And so they got married. My father converted to Catholicism in order to marry my mother. They got married because they didn't have any money. They got married at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, hoping that nobody would turn up for the wedding because they couldn't afford the reception. But my grandmother was a very well-known person. She had been a nurse herself, and she was connected with the hospital. My mother, by that time, had also been a nurse. She trained as a nurse by that time. So there were quite a lot of people that turned up for the wedding and the wedding breakfast afterwards. Um, I don't know who paid for it because I don't think my mum knew either who paid for it either. And then they were going to Nyanga, which is another region further north from where my mother grew up, for their honeymoon. And they got into my father's car and it broke down and they never got anywhere. So they ended up having their honeymoon in Salisbury because they couldn't go anywhere and nobody had a car to lend them.
Amazing.
Um, my father had got the managing of a farm about 3 hours outside Salisbury. Um, my mother was told that she couldn't have kids because she had fibroids, so she was not going to ever have kids. But lo and behold, she ended up being pregnant. And my father was a very difficult man because when my mother, bearing in mind, this is 2.5 hours outside the main city where the hospital was. And when my mother was 8.5 months pregnant, my father took her to the crossroads, gave her a hat and her suitcase, and said, "Right, off you go. Somebody will pick you up shortly. Put your thumb out, and you can go. And I'll see you when the child is born." Um, because he was too busy on the farm to take his wife in to have the child born. Uh, yes, my father was a piece of work. He then failed at that. He then went and became a butcher at Kariba. Kariba Dam is on the border between Rhodesia and Zambia. It's one of the biggest dams, was one of the biggest dams in the world at the time. It was built in 1956, 57, I think it was. Um, it's now a very big tourist place. And further down, you get the new dam, Koborobasa Dam, which is partly Mozambique. Um, but they stayed there until I'm not entirely sure what happened. And then they went to live in Zambia. They went to live in Zambia at the Copper Belt with my elder sister. And they were at the Copper Belt, which is on the border between Zambia and the Congo. And that was the time that the Congo fell, the Belgian Congo fell, and the Belgians were kicked out. And my mother remembers carloads of people coming through. Some were very badly burnt, some were very badly butchered. And of course, being a Catholic, one of the things that she always remembers was that they had a busload of nuns, and every nun had been raped because they were virgins, and therefore they were raped as part of the fighting with the black people in the Congo at the time. Now, you've also got to understand, I think the Belgian king at the time did very badly abuse the Africans in the Congo at the time. There's a lot of controversy about how they managed it at the time. But my mother remembered the atrocities coming out of Congo at the time. They were running a children's home at the time for girls who were not very good. Well, some of them were actually, today's standard, they probably weren't that bad. But in those days, they were certainly not, the standards were much higher than those days. Um, I'm not entirely sure what happened. I think what happened was my father became involved with the Knights of the Garter, which is a charity related to the Catholic Church. And instead of staying and helping my mother with these wayward girls, he spent more of his time with the Knights of the Garter. And I think the people who employed them decided actually this wasn't good enough. And so they terminated my mom's or their contract. So they came down to Lusaka, where my middle sister was born, and they lived in various houses because they couldn't afford housing. So they lived in various different houses. One of the houses that my mother went and actually burst into tears in front of the estate agent and said, I'm 9 months pregnant and I've got a young daughter and I've got nowhere to live. And this particular house was actually, I think the roof in one of the rooms had actually fallen in. And she got that house, and my elder sister calls it the broken down house. And they lived there, and my middle sister was born there. Well, in the hospital and born there and taken back there. Then things must have got a bit better because they were able to buy a house with the help of my aunt and uncle in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia at the time, in a place called Chilanga, which is just outside Lusaka. And I was born from there in Lusaka Hospital. And it had about 4 acres. My father was a butcher at the time, was still butchering at the time. And my mother started a market garden, and she sold various fruits that they had. She also got some gladiola bulbs and made a very good living selling gladiola flowers. This was at the time when Zambia, Northern Rhodesia was becoming Zambia. And so there were a lot of white people leaving Zambia. When it became Zambia, a lot of the English people who had been out under contract left. And of course, what then happened was a lot of black people took over the jobs. And of course, they didn't know how to run the jobs and what to do and so on. And so things went quite bad, quite fast. My father had a friend who told him about a piece of land that was being opened up because they were trying to keep the whites in Zambia. And this friend of John's and him went to look at this piece of land. It was 3,000 acres. It had 20 acres that had been de-wooded, so they could make a land on it, and a borehole. There was nothing else on it. And then came back and told my mother that she had to sell the house because he wanted this piece of land. And at the time, because she was a woman and because she was her husband, she didn't really have much choice, and so she had to sell her house. I remember when the Isuzu truck was bought. I was only about 3, but I remember the night it turned up at the house. I remember the evening that we left, the afternoon that we left the house to go to the farm, because they packed everything that they possibly could onto the truck. And then there were 7 black families that were coming with us, who then put on top of everything on top of the truck. And we had an old tortoise. And inside the tortoise were 3 kids, 9, 6, and 3. There were 4 cats, 3 dogs, 4 turkeys in the back of this tortoise.
Amazing.
And we went to the farm. Now, bearing in mind, it was about a 6-hour drive from Lusaka. It was tarred until we got to a place called Broken Hill. And then we took what they called the Great North Road, which was a road from Broken Hill that went into Malawi. At this time, it was starting to get dark. And we were going down, and of course, because that road was then a gravel road, it had just dried up after the rain, so there were a lot of ruts in the road. So we were bouncing along like this. The cats and the dogs and everything else that had been put into bags so we could keep control of them and also had been sedated. The sedation had then started to wear off, so the dogs and the cats and the chickens started awakening up. And then the back window of the car came down, so the car got full of dust at the same time. I do remember that. It's funny. It's one of those things that I do remember, but I don't remember arriving at the house, at the farm. But the farm we lived on didn't have a house, so we lived in a grass shack. And the grass shack had a sitting room and a bedroom. So we all slept in the bedroom, and the sitting room was there. And of course, the kitchen was about 100 yards away, so that you didn't burn the house down in case you got sparks off the kitchen. If you wanted a window in the house, you just put the arm through the wall, because that's where you could push the grass apart. I remember we used to have little nachapis. Little nachapis are about that size, little night apes. They used to come and bore holes along the top there. So at night, if you didn't have the mosquito netting over your bed, you would be covered in sort of dust like that when you wake up the next morning. We had what we called a long drop for a loo, about 200 meters away from the house. That was just a very long, very deep hole, and that's where you had your loo. And my mum sorted out a hose pipe from the borehole to there so that you could have a shower. But you had to be very careful, because the hose pipe had lain in the sun all day, so it was really, really hot. So if you stood under that immediately, you got burnt, because the water was like it was boiling. And then it would turn icy cold, because the water from the borehole was very cold. I think we were in the grass shack for 9 months, and then we had the rains came, and the rains washed us out of the grass shack. But my father had just finished building the tobacco barn, so we moved into the tobacco barn because we had nowhere else to live. And I remember we had a big hill out the back, and we used to have a monkey rope, and we used to play on that monkey rope at the back there. And then one day, one of our neighbors' kids were with us, and were telling my parents about this little man that kept watching them as they were playing on the monkey rope. And my parents were telling you, "Don't be so stupid, that's ridiculous. It's the way to have a look." And that's when they discovered that we were playing on an anthill, and in the anthill there were 2 pythons, one 12 feet long and the other about 8 feet long. So unfortunately, they went and killed the 2 pythons. I'm not entirely sure it was unfortunate, because I still to this day cannot abide the sight of snakes. At the time, we also, apart from the dogs and the cats that we also had a duiker, which was a small buck, and it became a pet of ours as well. I remember one Christmas, John got very ill at this Christmas. He had malaria, but he'd also bashed his leg, so he had the infection on his leg on top of the malaria. And my mum decided she didn't want her children to watch their father die. And she had to go to a mission which was about 70 miles further north from where we lived. It was a leprosy mission to get some medication for my father. So what she did, bearing in mind, I was 4, my middle sister was 7, my elder sister was 9, going on 10. She gave us a basket, and in the basket was all the Christmas dinner. And she said, right, in that direction, in about 6 or 7 miles, you get to the Marley Serpentines farm. Start walking. So we walked to the Marley Serpentines farm for Christmas while she went to get the medication to see if she could save my father. There are funny things like that come to your mind. There was also, they cleared, John and Veronica had just cleared one of the fields at the bottom, and they had gone walking with the dogs. And they got home and everything seemed all right. And then we'd gone to bed, and then they heard the dogs barking. And one of the dogs had got caught in a trap, and they had set fire to the wood to clear the grounds with, and the dog was in the way of the fire. So my mother, in her nightie, jumped out of bed and started rushing off through the bush to save this dog. My father got out of bed yelling and screaming at her for being such a stupid woman. You're going to put everything into danger. The 3 of us then got very frightened because we didn't know where they were. So we stood outside in the dark because, of course, there were no lights. We didn't have electricity, anything like that. Screaming because we thought our parents had run away from us and left us alone. So the whole compound came out to see what was going on. So that's what happened. Those are the kind of memories that I have from there.
Amazing. It's amazing stories of your life growing up in Africa, your life with your parents, your mother's bravery, your mother's courage, your mother's drive for independence. It's captured so wonderfully within the pages of this memoir that she wrote, that you've published. It is called Roni's Story, A Daughter of Africa by Veronica Walker. We've been joined by Phillipe Walker, her son today, who has been sharing excerpts of an unforgettable memoir of courage and reclaiming one's voice. Phillipe, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful hearing all of these stories. They are really mind-blowing on many levels. And we appreciate your candor, your wisdom, your wit, and your insight. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time, this time until next time on Spotlight.